Good afternoon. Now we're going to expand upon what we learned last week with randomized block design. And we're going to go into what's called full factorial mode, full factorial design. And with randomized block, remember that's from sampling. We start and we sample from pre-existing strata in the population to create then experimental and control groups within those strata. So we can then factor out the variability associated with these the strata, so we can focus on those predictors that we're more interested in. In a full factorial design, we're interested in every independent variable. Sometimes those will be experimental, and where we actually create an experimental and control group. Some of those will be pre-existing. And we don't make that distinction in the analysis, although you know, if you can't randomly select or randomly assign from the levels of a particular variable, you have to take that into account and and make sure that you do a very good job of being unbiased in your sampling procedure. But this time we're going to go straight into Matlab. Let me share my screen. We'll go into Matlab. You can see what I've done here is I've got a bunch of variables already loaded into column vectors. Okay, this is real data from a real study by Sanclemente and Hess. It's in chapter 13 in your readings. We've described it, but I've simplified it a little bit for this particular case. And what we have is we have a bunch of bolts. Okay, we have a bunch of bolts, and bolts. If you've ever used them before, it can be tighter or looser. And so what we have here is a vector, an outcome vector we're going to call force. And this is the force that was required to loosen loosen bolts. Okay, so we've tightened some bolts on, and we check on the force in newtons that it takes to loosen those bolts. Okay, now the things that cause bolts to remain tight or to loosen, there's many different factors. So for example, I've got two different types of bolts. I've got aluminum bolts, okay, that I've demi-coded as 0, and then I've got steel bolts, so aluminum versus steel. And if you think about brass fittings and aluminum fittings, that if you tighten those down, often they'll bind on each other because it's a softer material typically, and that material will then bind on itself. Kind of crush a little bit and deform, and that will make that fastener will be less likely to loosen, whereas steel is harder, and often you either have to crank on it much harder, or it does not tend to deform as much. So the material that our bolts are made of may impact the force which it takes to loosen the material. Okay, all other things being equal. Also the preload, right? The amount of load you put on when you tighten it. You can have a low preload, or you can have a high preload. And I've just got two different preloads, a certain certain number of newtons, okay, or excuse me, foot-pounds in this case, foot-pounds for torque, and then for low, and then a higher torque setting for high torque, okay, for the preload. And then whether or not we put lubrication on, where we spray a little bit of graphite spray, or where we use some WD-40 or something like that, or some mineral oil, or petroleum product. That lubrication matters, and so lubrication may cause it to be less likely to hold. Be more likely to loosen with smaller force. So each of these individually would be predicted to impact the force at which you would be required to loosen a bolt. Okay, so that's our hypothesis. But it may be also that the material and the amount that you preloaded, right? The aluminum preloaded with a higher torque, okay, may be tighter than let's say, steel with a higher torque. Okay? And so we have combinations of these factors that may impact the loosening of a bolt. Okay? So we've got these three factors, and what we want to do is we want to know their individual contributions, whether material matters, whether the preload matters, or whether lubrication matters. And then we also want to know if there are combinations of these that matter. Okay? And so what we're going to do is we're going to use an analysis of variance, a factorial analysis of variance. And here's how it goes. We're going to do it's exactly the same as with the randomized block. P comma table comma stats is equal to ANOVA in over. There we go. And then we're going to have force. Is our outcome variable. That's our continuous vector of the dependent variable. And then we're going to have three predictors. We're going to have material, preload, and lubrication. Okay. That tells, having those brackets on this, say these three are all independent variables. Okay. And then we're going to have sum of squares type, like we always do, the sequential sum of squares, so everything adds properly. And then we're going to have model. Okay? And what model does is it tells us that it will tell us which of these variables we're interested in and what combination. In this case, we're going to be just going to use full, okay, or a full factorial. If I only wanted to know the two-way interactions, I could say interaction. Okay, and that would be only the two-way by default in Matlab. We're going to see if there's a three-way interaction with this. Sorry. Okay, so model full. Okay, and then model full. Oh, alpha. Sorry, I think I've got alpha. Alpha, comma, 0.05, could be 0.01. Okay, we'll put 0.05 for this one. All right, now we can run it. And Matlab thought for very little, and we could take a look at our, oh, sorry. So one of the things that may be irritating you is that we get all this X1, X2, X3, and you have to keep track of all this stuff. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do exactly the same thing here, but then now I'm going to put bare names. This is a really nice thing to do. And the first one is called material, comma, and then we're going to do preload, comma, lubrication. These have to be put in the same order as they appear at the beginning part of this command. Material, preload, lubrication. Okay, material, preload, lubrication. Excuse me. Didn't like it. Oh, I didn't put the, okay. There. Pardon me, I'm sorry about that. I'm going to drink water. Didn't change anything except for now we have the label, so we know what these variables are. It makes it a lot nicer. Okay, so now you know. And so if we look at this, we say material. Okay, gosh, it's got pretty high sum of squares compared to the others. There were two groups of material. Mean squares high. F is very high. Probability is very low. So it looks like the material matters. If I've got steel versus aluminum, that matters. Okay. I can look at preload. And I'll say preload. Okay, high, very high. Okay, so preload matters. Of course, how much you tighten down that bolt will matter. Will influence how much force you have to take to unscrew the bolt. Okay, that makes sense. Lubrication. Lubrication really didn't seem to matter much. Okay, almost no variability predicted. Okay, F is tiny, probability is high, so lubrication really didn't matter for these bolts anyhow. Now we'll say, what material and preload? Do we have an interaction with material and preload? Same, very small sum of squares, very small F, very high probability. No, material and preload. Material and lubrication. No, it doesn't look like there's a difference if I lubricate the aluminum bolts versus the steel bolts. Okay, doesn't matter. Now let's look at preload. preload and lubrication. Well, let's take a look at this. Okay, it's got not a very big sum of squares compared to some of the others, but okay, there's two groups, mean square, oh, decent size F, and look at that, comes in under the wire. So it looks like we have a significant interaction between preload and lubrication. Here, we have a three-way interaction, and it's non-significant. So in this case, we say material matters, preload matters, and then some combination of preload and lubrication matters. Now, we don't really know. Let's take a look at how this plays out, how the interaction plays out. To do that, we do it. It's called an interaction plot. Interaction plot. What is it? Force on material. No, it's 2 and 3. It was preload, comma, lubrication. Okay. And then we're going to do var names again, so we can. No, hold on. I need to do another thing. I'm going to come back again. I apologize. I'm going to do group equals material, comma, lubrication. Sorry. Okay. Now we'll go interaction plot. No, where's my interaction plot? Okay. There we go. We're going to interaction plot, force, and then I'm going to use those groups. And what that will do is automatically combine the different groups of material and lubrication. And then we're going to call the variable names preload and lubrication. Okay. So this will give us a nice plot. It thinks a little bit and gives us an interaction plot. Let me make it a little bit bigger. Okay. So we can take a look at it. And what we're going to see here is we've got, this is lubrication equals 1 right there. Okay. Lubrication is equal to 1. Okay. And this is lubrication is equal to 0. And if we look at the lower levels of preload, okay, at low torque preload, lubrication results in a higher force needed to loosen the bolts. Okay, and here you'll see that no lubrication results in a lower force needed to loosen the bolts. But at a higher preload, lubrication allows the bolt to tighten more, and so it's harder to excuse me. At higher preload, it takes, well, let's go through the whole thing again. Let's start at the beginning. At a low preload, if I have lubrication, that makes it harder with lubrication, it's harder to loosen the bolt. At high preload, it makes it less hard to loosen the bolt. Conversely, if I have no lubrication, it's easier to loosen the bolt at a low preload. At a high preload, it makes it harder. Okay, so that's what that interaction is. Here we can see the same thing, only now for a low level of lubrication. Right, you can see that at the preload here that there's a difference of lubrication across preload. So this is just using lubrication as its as the x value, right, as the horizontal variable, and preload as the vertical. Whereas this graph over here has preload as the horizontal variable and lubrication as the vertical value. So these are entirely consistent with each other. But you can see, because those slopes are different, that there is an interaction. And when we take a look at the analysis of variance, we can see that it's a significant interaction. So if I'm paying attention here, I'm going to say, I'm going to pay attention to the material my bolts are made of if I don't want them to come loose, or likewise, if I need them to come loose. I also will pay attention to the preload, how much I torque them, so torque matters, right? And those matter the most, because you can look at their sum of squares. They account for a lot more of the variability than for preload lubrication interaction. But I would also pay attention to lubrication and preload. And if I'm just barely tightening it on, I might not use the lubrication. But if I really need it to make it tight, I will use the lubrication. Okay? And that is how we run a factorial analysis of variance with 3 predictors and all of the interactions. It's called a full factorial. That's it. Thank you very much, and have a lovely day.